Dad, perfect events. My son waited until I couldn't hold a pen steady, then slid a contract across the hospital tray table and said, "Just sign here, Dad. I'll handle everything." I signed. 11 weeks later, I was sleeping in a $74 a night motel with $340 in my checking account. And my wedding photo was listed on eBay for $12. My name is Ray Briggs. I'm 64 years old. I spent 38 years building Briggs Construction from one secondhand pickup truck into a $6.5 million operation. And I want to tell you exactly how my son took it from me and exactly how I got it back. It started with the stroke. Nothing dramatic. I didn't collapse on a job site or anything like that. I was sitting at my desk on a Tuesday morning, going over a subcontract bid, and my right hand just stopped working. Like someone cut the wire. I sat there for a minute thinking it would pass. It didn't. By the time the ambulance got there, the left side of my face had gone slack and my words were coming out wrong. The doctors called it a minor ischemic stroke. They said I was lucky. 3 weeks in the hospital, then another few weeks of rest at home before I could drive again. For a guy who'd been on a job site by 5:30 every morning for 4 decades, 3 weeks in a hospital bed felt like a prison sentence. Clifford came to see me on day 4, my son, 36 years old, Harvard MBA. The kid I worked double shifts to put through college. He sat down in the chair next to my bed, and he looked concerned, tired even. He said he'd been covering things at the office, making sure nothing fell through while I was out. He said the guys were holding up fine, not to worry. Then he said payroll was coming up, and he needed authorization to move some funds. He had a folder. He opened it, pointed to a highlighted line near the bottom of a page, and handed me a pen. I asked him what I was signing. He said it was just a temporary financial authorization, so he could keep payroll running without me having to deal with phone calls. While I was recovering, I signed it. My hand was still shaky from the stroke. I didn't read the full document. I trusted my son. I won't make that mistake again. What I actually signed was a proxy agreement with a buried clause that converted to a permanent transfer of controlling interest if ratified by a board vote within 60 days. Clifford called the board vote 3 weeks later, while I was still doing physical therapy. He'd already brought in 2 new board members I didn't recognize. He had Sandra Mercer lined up as the new CFO. 4 votes to 1, the motion passed. By the time I showed up to the office 5 weeks after leaving the hospital, everything had already changed. My parking spot had a different name on it. Lorraine, my secretary of 14 years, was at her desk, but she wouldn't meet my eyes when I walked past. The receptionist at the front desk, a young woman I didn't recognize, asked me if I had an appointment. I said I was Ray Briggs. I owned the company. She said she'd need to check with management. The meeting was already underway when I walked in. Clifford was standing at the head of the table. 8 people in the room. Some of them had worked for me since their mid-20s. Good people. People I'd hired myself, given raises to, helped out when things got tight in their personal lives. Not one of them said a word when I sat down. Clifford finished what he was saying, then looked at me and said, "Good. Now we can make it official." He put it to a vote. Every hand went up except mine. Then he looked at me across that table. That table I'd bought at an auction in 2003, hauled in with 2 guys from the crew, and he said, "You've given enough, Dad. This company needs leadership that understands where the market is going. We appreciate everything you built." He said it like he was reading it off a card. No hesitation, no guilt. I picked up my jacket. I walked out. I didn't say anything because there was nothing to say to a room that had already decided. You don't argue with a verdict that's been read. You figure out your next move. The drive back to my house took 25 minutes. By the time I got there, my key card for the office had already been deactivated. I know because I checked it at the gate out of habit. Red light, access denied. That was a Wednesday. By Friday, my personal salary account had been frozen, pending what Clifford's lawyers called a restructuring audit. The company truck got repossessed the following Monday. It was a company asset, they said, and the new management needed to inventory all vehicles. A guy in a flatbed came to my driveway at 7 in the morning, and I watched him load it up and drive away. I had my personal truck, a 2009 Ford F-150 with 140,000 miles on it. I had the clothes in my closet. I had about $4,200 in a personal savings account. Clifford's lawyers hadn't found yet, probably because I'd opened it at a credit union in 1987 and never linked it to anything digital. That $4,200 was all I had left of 38 years of work. I moved into the Starlight Motel on Route 9 about 10 days after leaving the house. I couldn't afford to keep the utilities running on $4,200, and the property taxes on the house were going to come due in 60 days. I needed to stretch what I had. The motel was $74 a night. Weekly rate came out to $469 if you paid Sunday to Sunday. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet. The window faced the parking lot. There was a microwave and a mini fridge and a TV that got 8 channels. I kept my 2 duffel bags on the luggage rack, and I tried not to think too hard about how I'd gotten there. Nights were the worst part. Not because of the noise or the uncomfortable bed, because when everything went quiet, I'd start doing the math. 38 years, 6 days a week, most of those years. Christmas mornings I spent finishing estimates. Summers my guys got off for the 4th while I was on the phone with suppliers. Every extra dollar went back, into equipment, into payroll, into making sure nobody missed a check even when jobs ran slow. And Clifford had taken all of it in about 60 days, with a pen and a folder and a practiced look of concern on his face. I tried not to dwell on it, didn't help anything. What I did instead was call people, old contacts, former clients, anyone who might have a small job that needed doing. I wasn't too proud to pick up day labor if it came to that. But word travels fast in construction, and word had gotten around that Ray Briggs was out at his own company under ugly circumstances. Nobody wanted to get in the middle of whatever legal situation was brewing. I understood it, didn't make it easier. About 3 weeks into the motel, I got an email from Phil Garrett. Phil had been one of my crew foremen for 11 years. Good man, never late, never made excuses. Clifford had let him go in the first round of cuts. Said the company was streamlining field operations. Phil didn't say much in the email, just a subject line that said, "Thought you should see this," and a link. I clicked it. It was an eBay listing. Seller name I didn't recognize. Listed under vintage workshop tools. Estate cleanout. Price to sell. The main photo was a wooden carrying case with initials stamped into the latch. L.B. Leonard Briggs. My grandfather's initials. I recognized every tool in the photos. The iron hand plane with the cracked wooden handle my grandfather had repaired with electrical tape sometime in the 1960s. The set of chisels in the canvas roll, each one stamped with a date from the 1940s. The heavy framing square with the scratch on one arm from the time Leonard dropped it on a stone floor. I knew these tools the way you know your own handwriting. Opening bid, $650 for the lot. I scrolled down. Second listing, same seller. Miscellaneous frame photos, assorted sizes, vintage. 12 photos in the lot. I recognized the third one in the row immediately. Carol in her white dress. Me in a rented suit that was a little too big in the shoulders. August 1986. We were standing outside St. Anthony's, squinting into the sun, laughing about something. I can't remember what, but I remember we were laughing. Opening bid, $12. Clifford had cleaned out the storage room at the office. He was calling it a modernization of the company image, getting rid of the old stuff to make room for something sleeker, something that looked more like the business he wanted to run. My grandfather's tools in my wedding photo were inventory to be liquidated. I closed the laptop and sat on the edge of the motel bed for a long time. I wasn't angry, or maybe I was past anger into something colder. I kept thinking about Leonard. My grandfather had given me those tools when I was 19, the summer before I started the company. He put the carrying case in the back of my truck and said, "These are for the work, Ray, not for the wall." He meant don't hang them up as decoration. He meant use them for what they were made for. I'd use them. Every one of them had marks from actual jobs. That hand plane had smoothed more door frames than I could count. Those chisels had shaped trim work in buildings that were still standing all over this county. Now they were listed next to used kitchen appliances and old fishing gear. That was the night I decided I was done feeling sorry for myself. Not because of some big moment of inspiration. More like I just got tired of sitting there. I picked up my phone and I called Lorraine. She answered on the second ring. She'd been let go 2 weeks after me. Clifford told her the company was going paperless and her position was being eliminated. She'd worked for Briggs Construction for 14 years. Her going away party was a card passed around the office that Clifford didn't sign. I asked her if she'd be willing to meet. She said yes before I finished the sentence. We met the next morning at a diner off the interstate. She had a folder with her. She'd kept copies of things, emails, internal memos, meeting notes. She'd kept them because she'd seen enough in those final weeks to know something wasn't right. And she was the kind of person who prepared for things not being right. I looked at what she had and I understood, for the first time, the full shape of what Clifford had done. The emails were damning, not because they were dramatic. They weren't. They were businesslike, almost boring in tone, which made them worse. Clifford and Sandra had discussed the whole plan in writing, like they were scheduling a vendor meeting. There was one thread from 6 weeks before my stroke, where Clifford wrote, "Once the old man signs the proxy, we won't need him involved in anything going forward." Sandra replied with a thumbs-up emoji and a note about onboarding the 2 new board members quietly before the vote. 6 weeks before my stroke. He'd been planning it before I even got sick. Lorraine also had documentation of something else. 2 subcontracting agreements, both signed while I was still in the hospital, both bearing my signature. The problem was, I hadn't signed them. I'd been in a hospital bed with an IV in my arm on both of those dates. Lorraine had cross-referenced the signing dates against my medical admission records, which she'd pulled from a copy I'd left in the office files years ago. Clifford had forged my signature, twice, on contracts worth a combined $900,000. That wasn't a civil dispute anymore. That was a felony. I left that diner with Lorraine's folder under my arm and drove straight to the one place I had left that was still mine. My grandfather Leonard's old property on the edge of town. Small house, half an acre, been in the family since 1941. The deed was in my personal name, nothing to do with the company, so Clifford's lawyers hadn't touched it. The place needed work. The porch boards were soft in 2 spots and the water heater was original to the 1970s renovation. But it was mine, clean and simple. I'd been using the back storage room to keep some boxes I'd moved out of the house. That afternoon, I started going through them, more to keep my hands busy than anything else. Old tax files, architectural magazines from the 90s, a box of hardware I'd saved from various jobs over the years. Behind a false panel in the back wall, plywood that had been painted over so many times it looked like part of the structure, I found an iron box, heavy, about the size of a shoebox, rusted completely shut. I knew it immediately. Leonard had kept it on a high shelf in his workshop when I was a boy. One time I asked him what was inside and he said, "That's for your rainiest day, Ray. Don't open it till the storm's really trying to break you." I figured this qualified. I worked the latch with a flathead screwdriver for about 20 minutes before the rust gave. Inside, sitting on what used to be velvet, was a thick piece of brushed steel, about the size of a playing card, heavier than it looked. Engraved on the face, Merchants Trust of Boston, Private Client, Leonard Briggs, and below that, a long string of numbers. Under the steel card was a folded land deed dated 1924, and a ground lease agreement, 4 pages, handwritten, dated January 1949. I read every word of that lease by the light of a work lamp. Then I sat on the concrete floor and read it again. Merchants Trust had been absorbed decades ago into what was now Hartwell Capital, a private banking group headquartered in downtown Boston. I drove there the next morning, wore the best shirt I had clean, walked in looking like exactly what I was, a guy who'd been living in a motel for 3 weeks, and asked for the private client desk. The lobby guard was polite about telling me to come back during branch hours. I put the steel card on the counter. He stopped mid-sentence, picked up his phone. 4 minutes later, a man in his late 70s came out of the elevator moving faster than someone with a cane had any right to move. Reginald Ashford, Chairman Emeritus. He took one look at the card, looked up at me, and said quietly, "We thought the Briggs line had ended." He brought me upstairs and explained it over coffee. Leonard Briggs had purchased 50 acres of scrubland outside town in 1924, when it was worth almost nothing. He'd seen the rail expansion coming. In 1949, he set up a ground lease with the operating company, Briggs Construction, which my father formally incorporated that year. The lease term was 75 years at $1 per year, with one clause written in plain language at the bottom of page 3. If controlling interest in the company ever passed outside the direct Briggs bloodline, the lease terminated immediately, and upon termination, all structures and improvements on the land reverted automatically to the trust. No court order, no negotiation. Automatic. I did the math out loud. 1949 plus 75 years. Reginald nodded before I finished. The lease expired 4 days ago, Mr. Briggs. Every building on that property, the fabrication plant, the equipment depot, the main office, the concrete yard, every machine bolted to those floors, the cranes in the south lot, all of it had reverted to the trust, to me, 4 days ago, while Clifford was sitting in the office I built, planning his next move. He'd taken the company, but he'd been standing on my grandfather's land the entire time, and now the clock had run out. I called Marvin Holloway from the parking garage. Marvin was the best real estate litigator in the state and had a personal grudge against Clifford dating back 3 years, to a deposition where Clifford had publicly embarrassed him. Some people you want, motivated? Marvin answered on the first ring. I said, I need you to listen to something. Don't talk, just listen. He listened. When I finished, there was a pause. Then he said, Ray, when do you want to move? I said, not yet, I need to know. When Clifford is planning to sell. Lorraine still had a contact inside the office, one of the project coordinators who'd been there since before Clifford took over. Through her, we learned that Clifford was in final negotiations with a private equity group out of Philadelphia, Bernard Kaufman's firm. They were offering $8.5 million for Briggs Construction, full asset acquisition. The signing was set for a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks out. We didn't move early. That was Marvin's call, and it was the right one. Frederick Graves, the asset recovery specialist Reginald brought in, spent 6 days running the forensic analysis on the 2 forged contracts. His report was 22 pages. The conclusion was 3 sentences. The signatures did not match Ray Briggs's authenticated handwriting across 14 verified samples. The pen pressure patterns were inconsistent with the subject's known signing habits. The documents had been fraudulently executed. Meanwhile, Marvin's office sent a letter to Briggs Construction's legal address, standard envelope, bureaucratic language, asking for confirmation of the current landlord on the 50-acre parcel for property tax assessment purposes. The kind of letter that looks like junk mail from the county. Lorraine watched Clifford flip through the mail stack that afternoon. He got to the envelope, glanced at it, and dropped it in the trash without opening it. That was fine. We just needed to confirm he'd had the opportunity. The Thursday of the signing, I wore a charcoal suit I'd bought with part of the trust's available cash. I hadn't worn a suit since Carol's funeral. Marvin met me in the parking garage 2 blocks from the office at 1:45. Frederick was already there. 2 U.S. Marshals arrived separately. They were there to serve a court order, not to make arrests. I'd been clear with Marvin about that. No theatrics, no handcuffs in the lobby. Just the facts, laid out in a room where Clifford couldn't reframe them. We walked in at 2:10. The conference room went quiet the second I pushed the door open. Clifford was sitting across from Bernard Kaufman and 2 associates. The contract was on the table. Clifford had a pen in his hand. He looked at me, and I watched his face move through 3 expressions in about 2 seconds. Surprise. Then anger. Then something underneath the anger that looked a lot like fear, though he covered it fast. You have no standing here, he said. Security. Sit down, Clifford. I didn't raise my voice. I pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. My chair, at my table, in the building my crews had built in 2006. Frederick stepped forward and placed the new title deed in front of Kaufman. Marvin laid the ground lease next to it, opened to page 3, the reversion clause highlighted in yellow. Marvin explained it plainly. The 75-year ground lease had expired. The reversion clause had triggered automatically. Every structure on the property, every piece of equipment attached to those floors had transferred to the trust 4 days before this meeting. Clifford did not own the assets he was attempting to sell. Kaufman picked up the deed. He read it once, then read it again. His associates were already leaning in to look. The room was completely silent except for the air conditioning. Then Kaufman looked at Clifford. You warranted clear title, he said. His voice was flat, professional. The kind of flat that means something is permanently over. It's a technicality. Clifford's voice had gone thin. We can negotiate a new lease. My father will be reasonable about this. We just need... There will be no new lease, I said. Kaufman set the deed down. He gathered his copies of the contract into a single stack, tapped them once on the table to align the edges, and tore them in half. Then he stood up, signaled to his associates, and walked out without another word. He didn't look at Clifford again. Neither did his team. The marshals served the court. Order. Operations at the facility were suspended pending resolution of title. Clifford and Sandra were instructed to surrender access cards immediately and vacate the premises. Clifford tried arguing. He threw terms around: adverse possession, unjust enrichment, equitable estoppel. Marvin let him finish, then explained one by one why none of those applied when a valid lease had been in place and the original contract contained an explicit waiver of improvement compensation. Then Marvin mentioned the forgery report. Clifford stopped talking. Sandra had already contacted the DA's office the night before through her own attorney. She'd made her calculation and decided cooperating was worth more than loyalty to Clifford. The criminal investigation would run on its own timeline. I didn't need to be part of it. I walked out of that building at 4:30 in the afternoon and stood in the parking lot for a minute. Same parking lot where they'd repossessed my truck 2 months earlier. The sun was low, and the light was hitting the metal roof of the fabrication plant, the way it always did in late afternoon, that particular orange that I'd watched from this exact spot more times than I could count. The first thing I did was call Phil Garrett and tell him he had his job back. Then I called 6 other people Clifford had cut. I rehired everyone willing to come back, restored their previous pay plus 20%, and reinstated their benefits from day one. A week later, I drove to the county auction where Clifford's asset liquidation had been halted by the court freeze. Leonard's tools were still in holding. I paid $650 for the lot and drove them out to the old house in the bed of my truck, the same way Leonard had brought them to me 45 years ago. That evening I sat on the porch of the house I'd been fixing up, the tool case open on the steps beside me. The iron hand plane was still solid. The chisels still had their edge. I ran my thumb across the LB stamp on the case latch and thought about an old man who'd bought scrubland nobody wanted, written a clause nobody remembered, and left it in an iron box for the day his family would need it most. He didn't know my name when he wrote that lease. He just knew someone down the line would need the ground to hold. It held. Some men leave money, some men leave land. My grandfather left me something better, a lesson written in iron. The man who owns the ground never loses the fight, no matter who holds the keys.